December 7, 1941. The date Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto orchestrated what he believed would be Japan's salvation became the moment he sealed his nation's doom. As waves of Mitsubishi Zero fighters screamed across the morning sky toward Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto stood aboard the flagship Nagato, thousands of miles away in Hiroshima Bay, knowing a terrible truth his colleagues refused to accept. They had not crippled a sleeping giant, but merely awakened one with infinite wrath. The architect of Japan's most audacious military strike harbored no illusions about America's industrial capacity. Unlike the jingoistic officers surrounding Emperor Hirohito in Tokyo, Yamamoto had walked the streets of Harvard University, studied at the Naval College in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and served as naval attaché in Washington during the 1920s. He had witnessed firsthand the towering steel mills of Pittsburgh, the endless automobile factories of Detroit, and the unprecedented wealth flowing through New York's financial districts. This was not the decadent, pleasure-seeking nation his fellow commanders described in their confident war plans. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," Yamamoto confided to his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, as reports confirmed the attack's tactical success. 8 American battleships damaged or destroyed, nearly 200 aircraft obliterated, more than 2,000 servicemen killed. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier strike force had achieved complete surprise, yet their commander felt only dread settling in his chest like cold iron. The Japanese High Command celebrated in Tokyo's Imperial Palace, their euphoria drowning out Yamamoto's warnings. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo raised sake cups with Army Chief of Staff Hajime Sugiyama, convinced they had bought Japan at least 2 years to consolidate their conquests across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Their intelligence estimates suggested America would require 18 months merely to rebuild its Pacific fleet, perhaps another year beyond that to mount any serious counteroffensive. By then, Japan's Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere would present an impregnable fortress, defended by battle-hardened troops and an unmatched naval aviation force. General Sugiyama spread maps across the conference table, his finger tracing Japan's new empire from the frozen Aleutian Islands to the tropical Solomon Islands, from conquered Burma to fortified Wake Island. "The Americans lack the will for prolonged warfare," he declared confidently. "Their democracy makes them soft, their diverse population prevents unity, and their geographic distance from Asia guarantees they will seek negotiated peace within 2 years." But Yamamoto knew better. He had watched American factory workers, seen their mechanized agriculture, observed their efficient transportation networks, and recognized their innovative spirit. The admiral understood that Japan's entire annual steel production barely exceeded what a single major American city like Pittsburgh could generate. He had studied American industrial mobilization during the Great War, witnessing how quickly the nation transformed civilian production into military might. According to research documented in The Rising Sun by historian John Toland, Yamamoto repeatedly cautioned his superiors that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict with the United States. His warnings fell on deaf ears, dismissed by commanders who had never witnessed American power firsthand, who believed samurai spirit would triumph over material superiority, who convinced themselves that Western democracies lacked the stomach for sacrifice. The admiral returned to his private quarters, knowing the celebrations above deck rang hollow. Japan had 6 months, perhaps a year, before America's true power manifested. The question haunting Yamamoto was simple yet terrible. When his colleagues finally realized what they had unleashed, would there be anything left of Japan to save? December 8, 1941. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress, his voice carrying across millions of radio sets throughout America, declaring December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. Within 33 minutes, Congress approved a declaration of war with only one dissenting vote. The industrial colossus Japan had antagonized began its transformation with breathtaking speed. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Admiral Chester Nimitz's intelligence officer, worked 18-hour days in Pearl Harbor's hastily repaired offices, piecing together Japan's strategic objectives. The enemy had struck brilliantly, yet curiously incomplete. Not a single American aircraft carrier had been present during the attack. The fuel storage tanks remained intact, and the submarine base suffered minimal damage. The Japanese had won a tactical victory, but failed strategically, leaving America's most valuable Pacific assets operational. Within weeks, American shipyards from Newport News to Mare Island received orders that seemed impossible. Construct aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, and transport vessels faster than any nation had ever built them before. The Bethlehem Steel Corporation in Quincy, Massachusetts, promised to launch escort carriers in just 3 months from keel laying to commissioning. Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, pledged to produce Liberty ships, 10,000-ton cargo vessels, in an average of 42 days. Donald Nelson, appointed by Roosevelt to chair the War Production Board in January 1942, orchestrated America's industrial conversion with ruthless efficiency. Automobile factories in Detroit ceased producing civilian cars overnight, retooling assembly lines to manufacture tanks, aircraft engines, and military vehicles. The Ford Motor Company's massive Willow Run plant, still under construction when war erupted, would eventually produce one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. General Douglas MacArthur, evacuated from the Philippines in March 1942 after a desperate defense, arrived in Australia promising, "I shall return." His confident pronouncement seemed absurd, given Japan's unbroken string of victories across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Singapore had fallen, Burma collapsed, the Philippines surrendered, and the Dutch East Indies capitulated. Japan controlled territory stretching across 15 time zones, defended by battle-tested troops who had conquered everything before them. Yet Admiral Nimitz, assuming Pacific Fleet command amid Pearl Harbor's still smoldering wreckage, recognized something his Japanese counterparts had not considered. America's geography provided unassailable security. No enemy bombers could reach Detroit's factories, Pittsburgh's steel mills, or Seattle's aircraft plants. Every ship Japan built came under potential attack from American submarines. Every Japanese factory existed within eventual bombing range. America could afford early defeats and learn from mistakes. Japan had to win immediately or face inevitable attrition. The first cracks in Japanese confidence appeared during the Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, launched impossibly from the carrier Hornet, struck Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The material damage proved negligible, but psychological impact reverberated throughout Japan's command structure. If American bombers could reach the sacred homeland just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, what would they achieve with another year of preparation? Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's raiders forced Japan to maintain fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft defenses on the home islands, resources desperately needed at frontline bases. More critically, the raid propelled Admiral Yamamoto into the disastrous Midway operation, an overconfident gambit to draw out and destroy America's carrier fleet. The Imperial Japanese Navy's most brilliant tactician began making uncharacteristic errors, rushed by politicians and army officers, demanding visible action to restore public confidence. In Washington, American military planners implemented Europe First strategy, agreeing with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill that Nazi Germany represented the primary threat. Yet even while prioritizing the European theater, American industrial production allocated substantial resources to the Pacific. The nation that Japan's generals dismissed as weak and divided demonstrated organizational capacity and unified purpose that defied pre-war assumptions. According to documentation from the National Archives researched by historians for Freedom from Fear by David Kennedy, American war production in 1942 alone exceeded Japan's total industrial output from 1937 through 1945. This staggering disparity remained invisible to Japanese commanders who measured military strength in courage, tactical skill, and warrior spirit, rather than unglamorous factors like steel tonnage, oil reserves, and manufacturing capacity. By June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the American military machine approached operational readiness for its first major counteroffensive. The sleeping giant had awakened, and its terrible resolve was about to manifest in the Central Pacific's azure waters. June 4, 1942, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled in the Pacific. 4 fleet carriers bearing the veterans who had devastated Pearl Harbor, crushed British forces in the Indian Ocean, and swept aside every opponent across Asia. His confidence bordered on arrogance as his armada steamed toward Midway Atoll, expecting to annihilate whatever token resistance America might offer. The Japanese plan embodied complexity bordering on fantasy. Admiral Yamamoto divided his forces into multiple groups: a northern force threatening the Aleutian Islands as diversion, Nagumo's carrier-striking force, an invasion fleet carrying troops to occupy Midway, and Yamamoto's main battleship force following behind. The dispersion violated basic military principles, but Japanese commanders assumed American forces remained too weak and demoralized to challenge their supremacy. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his cryptanalytic team at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had different information. Working in a basement without air conditioning in Hawaii's oppressive heat, Rochefort's codebreakers penetrated Japanese naval communications, identifying AF as the target for a massive operation in early June. Through clever deception, having Midway broadcast a false message about water supply problems in plain text, they confirmed AF meant Midway Atoll. Admiral Nimitz possessed what Yamamoto lacked: accurate intelligence about enemy strength, dispositions, and intentions. The American commander concentrated his available forces: 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, positioning them to ambush Nagumo's unsuspecting fleet. Nimitz violated conventional naval wisdom by committing damaged vessels and inexperienced pilots against Japan's elite forces. But he understood that America's industrial power meant nothing without buying time through early victories. Dawn on June 4th found Nagumo's carriers launching strikes against Midway's shore installations, while American aircraft from the atoll mounted desperate attacks against the Japanese fleet. Torpedo bombers from Midway achieved nothing, most shot down by Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Nagumo's confidence seemed justified as his combat air patrol destroyed attackers with contemptuous ease, and his first strike reported Midway's defenses softening for invasion. Then came the intelligence report that changed everything. American carriers sighted northeast of the Japanese fleet. Nagumo faced an agonizing decision. His carriers' hangars held aircraft armed with land attack bombs and torpedoes for a second Midway strike. Attacking American warships required changing weapons, a time-consuming process that would leave his ships vulnerable. Nagumo hesitated, issued contradictory orders, and critically delayed while his crews frantically rearmed aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, faced fuel exhaustion after failing to locate the Japanese fleet where intelligence predicted. Rather than return, McCluskey gambled and continued searching. At 10:22 in the morning, he spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northward and correctly guessed it was heading toward the main fleet. Minutes later, he discovered Nagumo's carriers, decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines exposed, and ammunition scattered about. What followed constituted the most decisive 5 minutes in naval history. American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown struck simultaneously, catching 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, completely vulnerable. Bombs penetrated wooden flight decks, detonating aviation fuel and ordnance in catastrophic explosions. Within minutes, 3 carriers that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months transformed into floating infernos. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, escaped immediate destruction and launched retaliatory strikes that damaged Yorktown. But American scouts located Hiryu by afternoon, and Enterprise's dive bombers sent her to the same fate as her sisters. In one day's combat, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots, and the strategic initiative. Yamamoto, monitoring the disaster from his distant battleship, ordered retreat, the first Japanese withdrawal of the Pacific War. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and now lay wounded aboard Akagi during its destruction, later wrote that Midway marked the moment Japan's offensive capability died. The Imperial Navy still possessed formidable strength, but losing 4 carriers and their aircrew represented resources Japan's limited industrial capacity could never replace. America, meanwhile, had new carriers already under construction, pilots training in vast numbers, and industrial production accelerating beyond Japanese comprehension. As documented in Shattered Sword by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, Japanese naval leadership initially concealed Midway's magnitude from their own government, informing Emperor Hirohito that only 1 carrier was lost. This dishonesty prevented realistic strategic reassessment when course corrections might still have achieved negotiated peace. Instead, the High Command committed to continued offensives they lacked resources to sustain, compounding their strategic bankruptcy. The battle's aftermath revealed America's advantages with stark clarity. Yorktown, damaged at Midway, demonstrated American damage control expertise before finally succumbing to submarine torpedoes. Japan's carriers sank within hours, their damage control proving inadequate. These details prefigured the coming war of attrition, a contest Japan could never win. November 20th, 1942. The Essex-class carrier Intrepid slid down the launching ways at Newport News Shipbuilding, the first of a revolutionary new class that would transform naval warfare. Just 11 months after Pearl Harbor, America commenced producing fleet carriers with astonishing regularity, each more advanced than Japan's entire carrier force. The Japanese High Command, still celebrating their strategic position across the Pacific, remained oblivious to the avalanche about to engulf them. Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, assuming command of Fleet Air Wing 1, reviewed pilot training reports that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. In 1941, America produced approximately 3,000 naval aviators annually. By late 1942, monthly production exceeded that number. The training pipeline expanded geometrically. Primary flight schools across the American South, advanced training in Florida and Texas, carrier qualification at newly established facilities on both coasts, and combat training that incorporated lessons from Coral Sea and Midway. Japan's naval aviation, by contrast, suffered irreplaceable attrition. The elite pilots who devastated Pearl Harbor and dominated through Midway represented years of selective training and combat experience. Japanese training programs emphasized quality over quantity, producing superbly skilled aviators in small numbers. When these veterans died in combat, replacing them required months or years. American training emphasized standardized procedures, allowing rapid pilot production while accepting lower initial skill levels that combat experience would remedy. Henry Kaiser, the industrialist transforming American shipbuilding, announced completion of the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch, a publicity stunt demonstrating what American yards could achieve with prefabrication and assembly line techniques. Kaiser's Richmond shipyards alone would eventually produce over 1,500 vessels, more tonnage than Japan constructed during the entire war. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, allocated resources for expanding the armed forces from fewer than 200,000 personnel in 1939 to a projected goal of 8 million by late 1943. This expansion required not just recruiting but equipping soldiers with unprecedented volumes of weapons, vehicles, ammunition, and supplies. American factories produced these materials while simultaneously supporting British and Soviet forces through Lend-Lease programs. The Japanese Army General Staff reviewed intelligence estimates about American production capacity, with disbelief bordering on contempt. Reports suggested American shipyards would launch 100 escort carriers by 1944, preposterous numbers that violated their understanding of industrial limitations. Lieutenant Colonel Tanamura Sako, a staff officer maintaining detailed war diaries, dismissed these estimates as propaganda designed to demoralize Japanese forces. This willful blindness permeated Japanese strategic planning. When Admiral Yamamoto requested additional carrier construction to replace Midway losses, the Navy Ministry promised new vessels, but delivered them with agonizing slowness. Converting battleship hulls Shinano and 2 others to carriers required years. Building fleet carriers from scratch stretched Japan's strained resources beyond capacity. Meanwhile, American yards launched Essex-class carriers every few months, each displacing 27,000 tons and carrying 90 aircraft. The Battle of Guadalcanal, raging since August 19, 1942, demonstrated these industrial disparities with brutal clarity. American forces landed on Guadalcanal to seize a strategic airfield, triggering 6 months of attritional combat on land, at sea, and in the air. Japan committed substantial forces attempting to dislodge the Marines, feeding troops piecemeal into a meat grinder, while American strength accumulated. Vice Admiral William Halsey, assuming South Pacific Command in October, brought aggressive leadership that matched his force's growing capabilities. When Japanese warships dominated nighttime naval battles in the waters surrounding Guadalcanal, nicknamed Iron Bottom Sound for the numerous vessels sinking there, American forces absorbed losses and returned stronger. Japan lost irreplaceable cruisers and destroyers, each one representing months of construction time and hundreds of trained sailors. According to statistics compiled in Eagle Against the Sun by Ronald Spector, American industrial production in 1942 included approximately 47,000 aircraft, 24,000 tanks, and 8 million tons of shipping. Japanese production totaled approximately 8,000 aircraft, 1,000 tanks, and less than 1 million tons of shipping. These ratios would worsen dramatically in subsequent years as American production accelerated while Japanese industry struggled under resource constraints and Allied submarine warfare. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding Japanese forces in the South Pacific, recognized his logistical nightmare. Every bullet, bowl of rice, and artillery shell required shipping from Japan through submarine-infested waters. American submarines, initially handicapped by defective torpedoes, received improved weapons by late 1942 and began devastating Japanese merchant shipping. Each transport sunk meant fewer supplies reaching frontline troops, fewer raw materials arriving at Japanese factories, and fewer reinforcements available for threatened garrisons. The strategic situation in the Pacific by year's end presented a tableau Japan's high command refused to acknowledge. America held Guadalcanal despite ferocious Japanese efforts to retake it, controlled Midway, maintained bases across Alaska's Aleutian chain, and prepared offensives that would leverage overwhelming material superiority. Japan's empire remained vast, but increasingly hollow, supplied through lengthening and vulnerable sea lanes, defended by forces that could not be adequately replaced. February 1, 1943. Commander Dudley Morton brought USS Wahoo into Pearl Harbor flying a broom from her periscope, the traditional Navy signal for a clean sweep. In 3 weeks of Pacific patrol, Morton had sunk 9 Japanese vessels totaling over 20,000 tons. His aggressive tactics represented the maturation of America's submarine force, transforming from a troubled service plagued by defective torpedoes into Japan's maritime executioner. The Japanese merchant marine, essential for sustaining their far-flung empire, sailed with astonishing complacency early in the war. Convoys remained unescorted or minimally protected. Ships traveled predictable routes, and anti-submarine warfare received low priority from commanders focused on surface fleet engagements. Imperial Japanese Navy doctrine emphasized decisive battleship confrontations, viewing merchant protection as unglamorous and secondary. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding submarines in the Pacific Fleet, finally received reliable torpedoes after nearly 2 years of war. Early American torpedoes ran too deep, failed to detonate, or circled back toward their firing submarines. These technical failures cost American submariners opportunities and lives, but patient testing and modification eventually produced weapons that exploded reliably. With functional torpedoes, American submarines became apex predators, hunting Japan's vulnerable supply lines. Captain Richard O'Kane, serving as Morton's executive officer aboard Wahoo, developed aggressive tactics that maximized torpedo effectiveness. Instead of cautious periscope attacks from distance, Morton and O'Kane closed to point-blank range, often surfacing to use deck guns against smaller vessels. Their methods risked detection, but achieved devastating results, and other submarine commanders began adopting similar approaches. The Japanese High Command remained curiously oblivious to their merchant marines' hemorrhaging losses. Cabinet Planning Board statistics showed merchant tonnage declining monthly, yet military planners allocated minimal resources to convoy protection or anti-submarine vessels. The Imperial Navy possessed excellent destroyer designs, but devoted them to fleet operations rather than escort duty. This institutional blindness would prove catastrophic. Japan began the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping, barely adequate for their expanded empire's needs. Maintaining oil flow from the Dutch East Indies, food from Southeast Asia, raw materials from occupied territories, and military supplies to garrison troops required constant shipping movement. American submarines targeted these vulnerable supply lines with increasing effectiveness, and Japanese shipyards could not replace losses quickly enough. Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of Naval General Staff, received intelligence reports about American submarine production capacity with characteristic dismissiveness. Even if reports proved accurate, suggesting dozens of new submarines entering service monthly, Nagano believed Japanese depth charges and destroyer escorts would neutralize this threat. He failed to grasp that America's industrial capacity allowed simultaneous expansion of submarine forces and surface fleets, an undertaking Japan's strained resources rendered impossible. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea in early March 1943 provided a stark preview of Japan's logistical vulnerabilities. American and Australian aircraft destroyed an entire Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce New Guinea, sinking 8 transports and 4 destroyers while killing thousands of troops. This disaster demonstrated Japan's inability to supply forward bases when facing coordinated air and sea power. Yet the High Command continued planning operations requiring supplies they could not reliably deliver. Rear Admiral Shigeyoshi Miwa, commanding the 6th Fleet Submarine Force, received orders to attack American supply lines, but lacked resources to significantly impact Allied logistics. Japanese submarines, designed for fleet reconnaissance and attacks on warships, proved less effective against merchant traffic. Cultural factors also limited Japanese submarine effectiveness. Attacking unarmed merchants seemed beneath warrior honor, and Japanese submarine commanders prioritized naval targets. According to naval historian Clay Blair's analysis in Silent Victory, American submarines sank over 5 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping during the Pacific War, plus hundreds of naval vessels. This tonnage exceeded Japan's total shipbuilding capacity, meaning their merchant fleet shrank continuously despite emergency construction programs. By mid-1943, this trend became statistically irreversible, though Japanese planners failed to recognize their predicament. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, captain of submarine I-58, returned from patrols increasingly frustrated by Japan's deteriorating situation. Fuel shortages limited operational time, torpedoes frequently malfunctioned, and American anti-submarine warfare improved dramatically. Destroyer escorts equipped with radar detected surfaced submarines miles away. Coordination between aircraft and surface vessels trapped submarines in impossible situations, and American damage control saved vessels that would have sunk earlier in the war. The combined fleet's staff officers in Tokyo compiled shipping loss reports with growing anxiety, but institutional momentum prevented strategic reassessment. Admitting the war was unwinnable would constitute defeat, an outcome samurai tradition rendered psychologically impossible. Instead, they planned increasingly desperate operations hoping for miraculous reversals, feeding precious resources into campaigns they lacked logistics to support. Captain Toshikazu Omai, a staff officer with keen analytical skills, privately calculated Japan's maritime sustainability and reached horrifying conclusions. Current loss rates meant merchant tonnage would decline to critical levels by mid-1944, potentially earlier if American submarine offensive intensified. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies, essential for fleet operations, could cease entirely within 18 months. These calculations suggested Japan faced economic strangulation, regardless of tactical victories. The submarine war represented industrial warfare's purest expression. American factories produced submarines faster than Japan could sink them, while Japanese shipyards could not replace merchants sinking at accelerating rates. This mathematical inevitability, obvious to any objective analyst, remained invisible to commanders who measured success in battleship tonnage and carrier aircraft, rather than unglamorous cargo capacity. June 15, 1943, American forces landed on New Georgia in the Solomon Islands, initiating a grinding advance through Japan's Pacific defenses. Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur implemented complementary strategies. MacArthur advancing through New Guinea toward the Philippines, Nimitz driving through the Central Pacific's island chains toward Japan itself. Both approaches shared a critical insight: bypass heavily defended positions, isolating them to wither while seizing strategic bases closer to Japan. The Japanese High Command anticipated American offensives, but expected frontal assaults against their strongest fortifications. They reinforced Rabaul in New Britain, constructed massive defenses on Truk Atoll, and fortified Wake Island, anticipating these strategic bases would become decisive battlefields. American planners, however, recognized that geography and air power rendered static defenses vulnerable. Islands beyond effective air support could be isolated and neutralized without costly invasions. Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, embodied this new strategic approach. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized seeking decisive engagements, Spruance prioritized methodical advances that leveraged American material superiority. His fleet included fast carriers, modern battleships, abundant amphibious vessels, and support ships sustaining operations far from established bases. Japan possessed nothing comparable to this mobile, self-sufficient striking force. The Gilbert Islands campaign in November 1943, attacking Tarawa and Makin atolls, demonstrated both American power and the learning curve associated with amphibious warfare. Marines assaulted Tarawa's beaches under devastating fire, suffering heavy casualties when landing craft grounded on reefs distant from shore. The three-day battle cost over 1,000 Marine lives, horrifying American public opinion, but providing invaluable lessons about tide calculations, naval gunfire support, and beach clearance procedures. Major General Holland Smith, commanding Marine amphibious forces, absorbed Tarawa's harsh lessons and refined assault doctrine. Future operations would include extended preliminary bombardment, underwater demolition teams clearing beach obstacles, specialized landing vehicles capable of crossing reefs, and close air support coordinated with ground advances. American military culture encouraged learning from mistakes, implementing improvements, and sharing lessons across commands. Institutional flexibility Japan's rigid hierarchy could not match. Emperor Hirohito received reports about Tarawa's aftermath with confusion. American forces sustained significant casualties, yet proclaimed the operation successful, immediately beginning preparations for subsequent offensives. Japanese commanders interpreted this as evidence of American insensitivity to losses, failing to understand that industrial democracy could absorb tactical setbacks while maintaining strategic momentum. Japan's Bushido-influenced culture viewed casualties as matters of honor. America's pragmatic approach treated them as problems requiring technical solutions. The Imperial General Headquarters, increasingly desperate, devised Operation Z, a plan to lure American carriers into a decisive engagement near the Palau Islands, where land-based aircraft would achieve the victory Midway had denied them. Admiral Minichi Koga, replacing the deceased Yamamoto as combined fleet commander, recognized Japan's deteriorating position, but believed one dramatic success might convince America to negotiate peace rather than continue costly advances. This strategic thinking represented profound misunderstanding of American political culture and industrial capacity. President Roosevelt had proclaimed unconditional surrender as Allied war aims at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. American public opinion, outraged by Pearl Harbor, supported complete victory regardless of costs. Most critically, American casualties, however tragic for individual families, constituted statistically minor proportions of a nation exceeding 130 million population with unlimited industrial resources. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding Japan's carrier forces, understood his fleet's weakness compared to American strength. Intelligence reports indicated America now operated over a dozen fleet and light carriers in the Pacific, with dozens more escort carriers supporting amphibious operations. Japan's carrier force had never recovered from Midway, and pilot quality declined steadily as veteran aviators died faster than training programs could replace them. Ozawa's carriers carried aircraft, but increasingly they were flown by barely trained pilots facing American veterans. The Marshall Islands Campaign, launched January 31, 1944, bypassed heavily defended atolls to seize less fortified but strategically valuable Kwajalein and Eniwetok. This operation stunned Japanese planners who expected Americans to attack predictable targets. By seizing unexpected objectives, Nimitz's forces advanced hundreds of miles, established new fleet bases, and positioned American air power within striking distance of Japan's critical bases at Truk and the Marianas. According to historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, American amphibious capability by early 1944 exceeded anything previously achieved in military history. The Navy and Marine Corps could transport, land, supply and support over 100,000 troops across thousands of miles of ocean, overwhelm defended beaches, and establish functioning bases within days. Japan possessed no equivalent capability and could not develop one with their limited resources. General Hideki Tojo, serving simultaneously as Prime Minister, War Minister, and Chief of Army General Staff, presided over increasingly desperate planning sessions. The cabinet received statistics showing American forces advancing, merchant shipping declining, and oil reserves diminishing. Yet Tojo maintained public optimism, promising the emperor that Japanese spirit would overcome material deficiencies. This delusion, equating determination with capability, permeated military planning, producing strategies divorced from logistical reality. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, commanding Tarawa's defense, had boasted that Americans could not take his fortress with 1 million men in 100 years. His garrison fought with suicidal determination, but American firepower and material superiority prevailed in 76 hours. This pattern would repeat across the Pacific, Japanese garrisons fighting to annihilation while inflicting casualties, but ultimately delaying rather than preventing American advances. Each delay cost Japan irreplaceable troops while American strength continuously replenished. The island-hopping strategy represented industrial warfare's geographic expression. America's vast production capacity meant distances and casualties that would exhaust other nations became manageable obstacles. Japan's limited resources meant every loss hurt irreparably. Every defensive garrison represented troops that could not be replaced, and every island's isolation demonstrated their inability to maintain supply lines against American air and submarine power. June 19, 1944, Admiral Ozawa launched Operation Eigo, gambling Japan's remaining carrier strength on a decisive engagement near Saipan in the Mariana Islands. His plan relied on land-based aircraft from Guam and Tinian supporting carrier strikes, theoretically offsetting American numerical superiority. What followed became the most lopsided carrier battle in history, forever remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American forces invading Saipan on June 15th had triggered exactly the Japanese response Nimitz anticipated. Saipan lay just 1,300 miles from Tokyo, close enough that B-29 Superfortress bombers operating from airfields there could reach Japan's home islands. The Imperial High Command recognized losing the Marianas would expose Japan to strategic bombing and committed their mobile fleet to preventing this catastrophe. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58, an armada that exemplified American industrial might. 15 fleet and light carriers bearing over 900 aircraft, 7 fast battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. This fleet exceeded the entire Japanese Navy's available strength and operated with logistical independence that previous naval forces could never achieve. Fleet oilers refueled ships at sea, ammunition vessels replenished magazines, and repair ships fixed damage without returning to port. Ozawa's mobile fleet appeared formidable on paper: 5 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, and supporting vessels. However, appearances deceived. His carrier air groups totaled fewer than 450 aircraft, many flown by pilots with minimal training. Japan's accelerated training program, desperately trying to replace losses, graduated aviators with perhaps 60 flight hours before carrier operations. American pilots typically accumulated 300 hours training before combat, including extensive gunnery practice and tactics instruction. The battle commenced when Japanese scout planes located American forces. Ozawa launched strikes from maximum range, hoping his aircraft's superior range would allow them to attack while American planes could not respond. This tactical advantage existed on paper, but dissolved against American defensive systems. Radar equipped every American vessel, detecting incoming attacks while they remained invisible beyond visual range. Fighter direction officers guided defending fighters to intercept positions with precision impossible for Japanese forces. Commander David McCampbell, leading Essex's fighter squadron, encountered the first Japanese strike wave 70 miles from the American fleet. What followed resembled training exercises more than combat. Japanese pilots flew predictable patterns, failed to take evasive action, and died in appalling numbers. McCampbell personally shot down 9 aircraft in a single engagement. Across the task force, American fighters massacred attackers with contemptuous ease. Ozawa launched 4 major strikes throughout the day, totaling over 370 aircraft. American combat air patrols and anti-aircraft fire destroyed approximately 300 Japanese planes, compared to fewer than 30 American losses. Pilots returning to American carriers reported targets so abundant and defenseless that shooting them down felt unsporting, hence, turkey shoot. Japanese aviators, poorly trained and facing overwhelming opposition, died without achieving significant damage. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vraciu, flying from Lexington, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes during the day's heaviest attack. He later described targets as, like an old-time turkey shoot back home. Vraciu's experience was typical. American pilots with adequate training and superior aircraft massacred Japanese formations that would have posed serious threats 2 years earlier. Worse yet for Japan, American submarines operating near the Philippines intercepted Ozawa's fleet. USS Albacore torpedoed carrier Taiho, Ozawa's flagship, causing damage that poor Japanese damage control transformed into catastrophic explosions hours later. USS Kavala sank veteran carrier Shokaku, survivor of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea. In one day, Japan lost 2 fleet carriers and over 400 aircraft, losses that could never be replaced. According to records examined in Clash of the Carriers by Barrett Tillman, the Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated categorical American superiority in every warfare dimension: radar, fighter direction, pilot training, aircraft performance, damage control, and tactical doctrine, all favored American forces overwhelmingly. Japan's numerical inferiority was bad enough. Their qualitative disadvantage proved insurmountable. Admiral Toyota Soemu, commanding the combined fleet from Tokyo, received Ozawa's reports with barely concealed despair. Operation Eigo, Japan's carefully planned counteroffensive, had achieved nothing while gutting their remaining carrier aviation. The mobile fleet retreated, its carriers reduced to floating targets carrying minimal aircraft. The Imperial Japanese Navy's offensive capability effectively ceased to exist. Emperor Hirohito, briefed on the disaster privately, asked Vice Admiral Ito Seiichi, his naval aide, whether Japan could still achieve victory. Ito, bound by tradition to maintain optimism before the emperor, suggested that Japanese spirit might yet prevail. But privately, Ito understood Japan had lost the Pacific War definitively. American carriers now operated with impunity. Japanese air power was destroyed beyond recovery, and the home islands lay vulnerable to attack. The fall of Saipan in July 1944 triggered political crisis in Tokyo. Prime Minister Tojo, whose optimistic predictions had consistently proven false, resigned under pressure. His successor, General Kuniaki Koiso, inherited an impossible situation. American forces advancing unstoppably, resources depleting rapidly, and military capabilities deteriorating monthly. Yet surrender remained psychologically impossible for leaders raised in samurai traditions, viewing capitulation as ultimate dishonor. The Marianas Campaign's strategic consequences extended beyond tactical defeat. American Seabees constructed airbases on Saipan and Tinian, and by autumn 1944, B-29 bombers began attacking Japanese cities and industries. These massive aircraft, flying from bases invulnerable to Japanese countermeasures, would systematically destroy Japan's remaining industrial capacity. The bombing campaign represented American industrial power's ultimate expression, producing complex 4-engine bombers in quantities sufficient to attack Japan continuously, while simultaneously supporting massive ground and naval campaigns. General Yoshijiro Umezu, assuming duties as Army Chief of Staff, reviewed intelligence assessments about American bomber production and aircraft deployment with mounting horror. The numbers seemed impossible. Boeing factories in Seattle and Wichita producing hundreds of B-29 bombers, each costing more than an entire Japanese infantry battalion's annual budget. Yet reconnaissance confirmed these aircraft appearing over Japan in growing numbers, their bombing accuracy improving with each raid. October 20th, 1944. General Douglas MacArthur waited ashore at Leyte in the Philippines, fulfilling his promise to return. Behind him stretched an invasion fleet larger than the D-Day Armada that had liberated France 4 months earlier. The subsequent Battle of Leyte Gulf would become history's largest naval engagement, and Japan's final desperate gamble to reverse their irreversible defeat. Admiral Toyota ordered Operation Shogo, throwing Japan's surviving naval forces against American invasion fleets in a complex plan requiring perfect coordination and divine intervention. The strategy reflected desperation rather than reason. Surface forces would transit narrow straits under air attack to reach American transports, while a decoy carrier force would lure away American fast carriers. The plan assumed Japanese courage could overcome American material superiority, the same assumption that had failed consistently since Midway. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the center force. 5 battleships including the massive Yamato and Musashi, 12 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. These vessels represented Japan's finest remaining warships, but they sailed without air cover into waters dominated by American aircraft. On October 24th, American carrier planes found center force in the Sibuyan Sea and attacked relentlessly throughout the day. Musashi, the world's largest battleship, absorbed 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb strikes during 6 hours of continuous assault before capsizing. This unsinkable battleship's destruction symbolized battleship era's definitive end. Air power now ruled naval warfare, and Japan's carrier forces had been annihilated at Philippine Sea. Kurita's surviving ships pressed forward despite losses, demonstrating courage without addressing strategic bankruptcy. The battle off Samar, on October 25th, produced war's supreme irony. Kurita's battleships surprised a small American escort carrier group protected by destroyers and destroyer escorts, vessels designed for convoy protection rather than combat against capital ships. The American tin cans attacked suicidally, launching torpedoes and gunfire against opponents outweighing them 20-fold. Their incredible courage and aggressive tactics confused Kurita, who withdrew believing he faced main American forces rather than a sacrificial escort group. Commander Ernest Evans, captain of destroyer USS Johnston, exemplified American fighting spirit. His destroyer attacked Japanese battleships and cruisers with reckless valor, absorbing devastating damage, but disrupting enemy formations and protecting vulnerable escort carriers. Johnston sank after expending all ammunition, Evans dying with his ship. Such determination, combined with overwhelming material superiority, rendered Japanese defeat inevitable. Simultaneously, Vice Admiral Ozawa's decoy carrier force succeeded perfectly in luring Admiral Halsey's fast carriers northward. Halsey took the bait, leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded and allowing Kurita to surprise American escort carriers. Yet this tactical success changed nothing strategically. Ozawa's carriers carried minimal aircraft, existed only as bait, and were systematically destroyed when Halsey's planes attacked. Japan sacrificed 4 carriers, achieving temporary confusion that American material abundance quickly rectified. According to naval historian H.P. Wilmot's analysis in The Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers during the multi-day engagement. American losses totaled 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. More critically, Japan expended its final operational naval forces on a gamble that achieved nothing. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a fighting force. The kamikaze attacks beginning during Leyte Gulf represented Japan's ultimate admission of defeat. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi organized suicide attacks because conventional forces could not damage American ships. These desperate measures inflicted casualties and damage but could not prevent American advances. A nation resorting to suicide attacks had acknowledged its conventional military capabilities' exhaustion. Lieutenant Yukio Seki led the first organized kamikaze attack on October 25th, diving his Zero fighter into escort carrier St. Lo, sinking her. Japanese propaganda celebrated this divine wind as war-winning strategy, but honest commanders recognized desperation behind the rhetoric. Asking pilots to deliberately die reflected Japan's inability to compete through normal military means. Back in Tokyo, the Supreme War Council received Leyte Gulf reports with stunned silence. The combined fleet, which had dominated Asian waters since Pearl Harbor, was effectively destroyed. Oil reserves approached critical levels, making sustained naval operations impossible. American submarines had reduced merchant tonnage to fractions of wartime requirements. Strategic bombing from the Marianas was beginning to destroy Japanese cities and industries systematically. Finance Minister Seihin Ikeda presented economic analyses to Prime Minister Koiso that predicted complete industrial collapse within 12 months. Steel production was declining due to raw material shortages, coal mines could not produce adequate fuel, transportation infrastructure was deteriorating under bombing, and civilian food supplies approached starvation levels in urban areas. The empire Japan had conquered to secure resources was now completely isolated, its materials unreachable behind American submarines and air power. General Curtis LeMay, assuming command of 21st Bomber Command in January 1945, revolutionized strategic bombing by switching from high-altitude precision attacks to low-altitude incendiary raids. On the night of March 9th through 10th, 1945, over 300 B-29s dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo, creating firestorms that killed approximately 100,000 civilians and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. This single raid inflicted more casualties than either atomic bomb would later cause. The firebombing campaign devastated Japan's urban centers methodically. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens of smaller cities experienced similar destruction. Japanese air defenses, already weak, proved completely inadequate against massed B-29 formations flying at night. American industrial capacity produced sufficient bombers, fuel, and ordnance to attack continuously, while Japan's manufacturing capacity shrank under the bombardment it could not prevent. As documented in research from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey conducted after the war, American industrial production in 1944 exceeded all Axis powers combined. The United States manufactured 96,000 aircraft, 17,000 tanks, and produced warships totaling millions of tons. Japan manufactured 28,000 aircraft, 400 tanks, and shipping totaling hundreds of thousands of tons, most of which American submarines immediately sank. The disparity had grown so extreme that comparison became meaningless. Field Marshal Hajime Sugiyama, who had confidently predicted American weakness in 1941, now confronted catastrophic reality. American forces approached Iwo Jima and Okinawa, within fighter range of Japan's home islands. The Soviet Union appeared ready to abandon their neutrality pact and attack Manchuria. Japanese cities were burning, factories shuttered for lack of materials, and population faced starvation. Everything Yamamoto had feared and warned about had manifested with terrible precision. April 1st, 1945. American forces landed on Okinawa, just 350 miles from Japan's main islands, beginning the war's bloodiest campaign. By now, even the most delusional Japanese commanders recognized their inevitable defeat, yet surrender remained psychologically impossible. The Bushido Code, emphasizing death before dishonor, trapped military leadership in suicidal strategies they knew were futile. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded Okinawa's defense with 32 Army divisions and 9 Navy brigades. Over 100,000 troops committed to fighting to death in an unwinnable battle. Ushijima understood American firepower would eventually overwhelm his forces, but tradition demanded he delay the inevitable as long as possible. Killing maximum Americans to make invasion of the home islands seemed too costly to attempt. The campaign vindicated Ushijima's pessimism. American forces possessed overwhelming advantages: naval gunfire from dozens of battleships and cruisers, carrier aircraft providing close air support, abundant artillery, flame-throwing tanks, and unlimited supplies. Japanese defenders occupied fortified caves and fought with desperate courage, but courage without logistics or reinforcements guaranteed eventual annihilation. By late June, organized resistance ceased, and Ushijima committed ritual suicide rather than face surrender's dishonor. Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's former chief of staff now commanding 5th Air Fleet, orchestrated kamikaze attacks from Kyushu against American vessels surrounding Okinawa. Over 1,500 suicide planes struck during the 82-day campaign, sinking over 30 American vessels and damaging hundreds more. These attacks inflicted significant casualties but achieved nothing strategically. American industrial capacity replaced losses faster than kamikazes could sink them. The Okinawa campaign cost over 12,000 American casualties, horrifying numbers that convinced American planners that invading Japan's home islands would produce unacceptable losses. Yet Japanese leaders misread this concern as evidence Americans might negotiate peace rather than accept casualties from invasion. This miscalculation, rooted in fundamental misunderstanding of American political culture and determination, prolonged the war unnecessarily. Emperor Hirohito, receiving daily reports about destroyed cities, starving civilians, and military defeats, privately questioned continuing the war. Yet the Supreme War Council remained deadlocked between peace advocates and military hardliners who insisted Japanese spirit would prevail even against hopeless odds. The council could not agree on surrender conditions, particularly regarding the emperor's status, while American bombers systematically destroyed everything remaining. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo initiated desperate diplomatic efforts through the Soviet Union, hoping Stalin might mediate negotiated peace. This strategy ignored reality. Stalin planned entering the war against Japan to seize territory, not broker peace. The Soviet Union had denounced their neutrality pact in April, and massive Red Army forces massed on Manchuria's borders, awaiting optimal timing to attack. Japan's last diplomatic hope was pure delusion. On July 16, 1945, scientists successfully tested the atomic bomb at Alamogordo, New Mexico. President Harry Truman, succeeding Roosevelt after his death in April, now possessed a weapon that might force Japanese surrender without the casualties predicted for home island's invasion. The Potsdam Declaration, issued July 26, demanded Japan's unconditional surrender, warning of prompt and utter destruction if they refused. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki's government issued no formal response to the Potsdam Declaration, a silence Americans interpreted as rejection. In reality, the Supreme War Council debated endlessly while unable to reach consensus. Hardliners insisted on continuing resistance, hoping casualties from invasion would convince Americans to negotiate. Peace advocates recognized defeat, but could not overcome military opposition. This paralysis guaranteed the nuclear attacks that followed. August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, killing approximately 70,000 people instantly, with another 70,000 dying from radiation effects subsequently. 3 days later, Boxcar dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki, killing approximately 40,000 immediately. Between these attacks, the Soviet Union declared war and launched massive offensives into Manchuria, destroying Japan's Kwantung Army within days. The twin shocks of atomic bombs and Soviet invasion finally broke the Supreme War Council's deadlock. Even hardliners recognized continuing resistance meant Japan's complete annihilation. Emperor Hirohito, in an unprecedented intervention, decided Japan must accept the Potsdam Declaration. On August 15th, his recorded surrender announcement broadcast nationally, his voice never before heard publicly, informing Japanese citizens they must endure the unendurable and accept defeat. Admiral Ugaki, refusing to accept surrender, led a final kamikaze attack on August 15th, diving his plane into the sea without finding targets. His death symbolized the samurai mentality that had led Japan into unwinnable war and prevented rational strategic decisions throughout the conflict. Courage and determination, without matching industrial capacity and realistic assessment, had produced catastrophic national defeat. General MacArthur accepted Japan's formal surrender aboard battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. Behind him anchored hundreds of American warships, physical manifestation of the industrial power Yamamoto had feared and the High Command had dismissed. These vessels represented a fraction of America's total production. Dozens of Essex-class carriers, hundreds of destroyers, thousands of landing craft, each one testament to industrial capacity Japan could never remotely match. Field Marshal Sugiyama, who had promised quick victory in 1941, committed suicide rather than face occupation. Prime Minister Tojo attempted suicide but survived to face war crimes trial. Admiral Toyota escaped prosecution, but lived with knowledge his strategies had failed utterly. These men, finally confronting American power's full magnitude, recognized the delusion underlying their confident 1941 predictions. The final accounting was devastating. Japan suffered over 3 million military and civilian deaths, lost its entire empire, faced occupation for the first time in history, and saw its major cities reduced to ruins. American industrial production during the war exceeded Japan's total economic output for the previous century. The disparity Yamamoto had warned about manifested exactly as he feared. America's sleeping giant awakened, filled with terrible resolve, and crushed Japan through overwhelming material superiority. In the war's aftermath, captured Japanese officers expressed astonishment at American industrial capacity they had witnessed. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived the war, toured American factories and military installations, finally understanding what Yamamoto had tried explaining to deaf ears. The steel mills, shipyards, aircraft factories, and automobile plants operating at scales Japan could never imagine had produced the avalanche that buried Japanese ambitions. The lesson was stark and timeless. Courage, tactical skill, and warrior spirit could not substitute for industrial capacity, technological innovation, and economic strength in modern warfare. Japan's military culture, emphasizing intangibles over material factors, had led them into catastrophic miscalculation. By the time the High Command realized America's true power, their cities were ashes, their military destroyed, and their emperor broadcasting surrender to a shattered nation. Admiral Yamamoto's warning haunted surviving commanders. He had seen American power, understood its implications, and predicted Japan could not win a prolonged war. His colleagues dismissed these concerns as defeatism until overwhelming evidence forced recognition. But that recognition came far too late, after millions died and Japan lay devastated. The sleeping giant had indeed awakened, and its terrible resolve had exacted a price beyond imagination.